Thank you for watching Conscious Consumer Network. The live stream broadcast is free to view. You can pause and rewind live broadcasts to catch up, or view shows at a later date by accessing our free archives of all shows. Check out our broadcast guide to see what's on. You can show your support by donating to our network support fund. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, or subscribe to the monthly newsletter for updates. We thank you for supporting free and independent media. This is pretty casual, just a casual chat. I'm all trying to gather facts around this because it's such an anomaly. First off, before we start climbing into it, thank you very much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it. I'm actually not terribly well, and I didn't want to cancel because I've been waiting for this opportunity for so long, and I'm really glad to be speaking to you and to find out more about your work and your excavations and stuff. But first, I'd like you to introduce yourself. Just give a little bit of a background, if you don't mind.
Certainly. My name is Sheila Coulson. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Oslo in the Department of Archaeology. And I think probably most relevance to what we're going to be talking about today, I have over 2 decades now of experience working on projects in sub-Saharan Africa, mainly concentrating on Botswana.
Okay. All right. And why archaeology and anthropology? I mean, what drove you to that career as a child?
Well, that's a very good way of putting it. I was actually, when I was 5, I got my mom to take a book out of the library because it was in the adult section and I wasn't allowed to have access to those. And it was Thor Heyerdahl's Aku Aku. And that was the very first time I realized you could make a career out of being an archaeologist. Now, it's very funny that years later, with having no background in having any relatives or anything in Norway, I ended up in Norway, the home of Thor Heyerdahl, and he was the one that originally made me understand that you could have an amazing life as an archaeologist. I started with that when I was 5. When I got to university, I thought, oh, it's just a childhood dream. I tried other subjects, and I always went back to archaeology. It was burned into my brain from a small child, and I've stayed with it since.
Fantastic. So talk a bit about some of the sites that you've excavated, apart from the one we're going to be speaking about today at Tsodilo Hills.
Well, I've been very fortunate in the area of specialty, which is the early Stone Age. I've been able to travel quite a bit of the world. So I have worked in a number of sites in North America before I moved to Europe. Since then, I've worked on a number of sites, specifically in England and in the Dordogne in France, and obviously here in Norway, Greenland, and then I had a classic opportunity to get to work in Africa as well. So I've had a number of excellent chances to work on other sites.
I must just tell you, as a kid, I was absolutely in love with the idea of archaeology. And I really wanted to become an archaeologist, just like you. I loved it. And my mom says, do you want to spend your whole life digging in the dirt?
She has a point. At one stage you have to say, my knees are starting to ache. And maybe I want to take a little bit of a step back. But the good thing, and unfortunately your mom didn't know, that at one point or another, you get to be the one that stands up and just points and tells other people what to do. And that, you think when you're younger, you go, oh, I never want to have that, actually. You know, I want to be able to dig all the time, and the novelty does wear off.
I bet. And I did love my sandbox. So when she told me that, I didn't think it was a bad thing, per se. And I've always been inspired since a young child and started getting really into it when, I suppose, Graham Hancock started popularizing it more 20 years ago with some of his works, which are really outside the academic box with a lot of his stuff, which has been proven now by many academics. In fact, there's a lot of validity to some of the stuff he talks about. And that's really the entrance point for me. But I was fascinated that there had been little to no, except for your work, done on this Tsodilo Hills, and I just want to first start off with, perhaps can you give us a bit of background on the area?
Yeah, certainly. Tsodilo Hills is a very, very exceptional spot in the landscape. One step even further back, one thing that is not common knowledge is that 80% of Botswana is covered by the Kalahari. Now, you think the Kalahari is a very, very contained little space, but in fact, most of Botswana is in the Kalahari Desert. Now, Tsodilo Hills are in the northwestern section of Botswana, up by the Okavango Panhandle, and they are very exceptional. When you're driving up through that area for the first time, you can't help but notice them. They are the only hills, like mountainous rocky outcrops, for over 100 kilometers in any direction. So when you're driving through this very, very flat landscape and you see these things off in the distance, you're immediately stricken by how incredibly predominant they are. Now, that landscape won't have changed very much at all in many tens of thousands of years. So they're an obvious focal point in northern Botswana. Now, keep in mind the fact that in Botswana and, in prehistoric times, of course, it wouldn't have been Botswana, it would have been just a large section of the Kalahari that includes Namibia, Angola, Zimbabwe, all these other countries as well. This was a spot that would be a natural meeting spot. It would be a focal spot. And because of the very rich prehistory of this one particular set of hills, Tsodilo Hills, it's the very first World Heritage Site that Botswana was awarded. So it's a very, very special spot on the landscape. Most well known for its extremely high number of rock art panels, but any rock art which is painted rock art, of course, has to be relatively recent because paint just simply disappears in time. So it's very, very well known for its rock art panels, and that was one of the things that immediately attracted archaeologists, because whenever there's been a natural focal point in a landscape, and there's lots of rock art, that means it'll have undoubtedly a very rich prehistory.
Okay. So what are the dates in some of the rock art? How old are we looking at some of the pictures being?
The rock art, as I mentioned, by definition, as soon as it's painted, it's only a matter of anything from 100, 200 years ago to maybe 1,000. The paint simply, because most of these painted panels are exposed to the weather, they just simply weather away. Yeah. And there's very strong winds in this area. There's extremely intense sunshine. And so they are from a period that is much more recent.
Okay. And I'd really like to go on to talk a little bit about the Serpent Cave. I'm not terribly sure what to call it, Rhino Cave or Serpent Cave, because there seems to be a misunderstanding as to what the official title is. I was wondering if you could give some clarity on that.
Yes, it's officially called Rhino Cave. It was named by the original excavators, which were another team of archaeologists that worked there in the 90s that had a very long history of working up at Tsodilo Hills. The early excavators are Alec Campbell, who used to be the director of the museum in Botswana, and Larry Robbins and their team of archaeologists. They worked there for many, many years. Unfortunately, Alec Campbell passed just a few years ago, and Larry Robbins has not really returned to the sites at Tsodilo in a period of time, and other archaeologists have now started working there. But they were the pioneers, and we owe a great deal to their initial works. They were specifically seeing how long a prehistory was actually able to be related to these hills. And on the basis of their work, we know that a number of the sites have dates from 100,000 years ago right up to recent times. So it has been, as we would have anticipated, used and known about for a very long period.
Wow, 100,000 years. This is a gathering, a meeting point since about 100,000 years ago, what you can date it.
Yes, and when you see it in the landscape, it's no big surprise. It's an obvious location.
Yeah, in such a flat landscape, I would imagine, you know, you see it from so far,
Mhm.
to draw people together, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, okay, so the actual carving of the serpent in the cave, Rhino Cave, is there any way to deduce how old those markings are, those undulations on the skin?
No, because of course, unless there's some organic material adhering to it, you just simply have stone. I think one thing that would be a very prominent point to make before we actually talk about the carvings on the rock panel is the fact that if you can imagine a very, very open landscape that is mainly sand and very, very little rock, the idea of being close to a rock surface is very unusual in Botswana. The idea of being surrounded by rock is very, very exceptional. So even today, if you approach the hills with people from Botswana, they find this a very exciting, very, very unusual development to be walking on rock, and then when you get to the cave itself, to actually be surrounded by rock. That is so unique in that environment that you can then see how this Rhino Cave, which is a hidden cave, it's very, very hard to access. It was not found by archaeologists. It was shown to the archaeologists when they were auditing the area to find points to make it listed as a World Heritage Site. It's very, very hard to gain access to the cave. You have to scramble over huge boulders that are like the size of a shed. You'd have to squeeze between them. And one of the things that I always do to slightly amuse myself when I'm working up there and I'm bringing visitors to the site, I'll take them there 2 or 3 days on the run, and then I'll say, you show me the way. It's very easy to get lost trying to find your way there. It's not an obvious, even if you've been there a number of times, you reach a junction point where you're down squeezing between rocks and you go, is it this way or that way? So accessing this site is very, very difficult and very arduous. Then to gain entry into the site, it's a tiny, teeny little location that's actually back down from you. So you climb up, all the way up to the top. And then there's just a little hole that you see that you have to scramble down back over the boulders to gain entry to it. So it really is. It's a hidden cave. It's also tiny, teeny. It's only 11 meters long and about 5 meters wide, with a floor space that's about 22 square meters, which is about the size of your average living room. So it's not an obvious site for habitation or for normal types of use. If you think of yourself as a hunting person and you've gone and you've killed a large land animal, the idea of trying to drag that carcass all the way up to that site as your habitation site would not be an obvious choice by any means.
Okay, well that brings up the next question, the next set of questions actually with regards to, do you reckon that this is like a sacred temple type enclosure, perhaps where there was ritualized activity?
Yeah, I would say that when, as an archaeologist, you enter this site, the first thing that you're very struck by is that no matter what time of the day, no matter what time of the year you're there, it never gets direct sunlight into it. Now, there's a plethora of sites at the base of Tsodilo Hills that have good open shelter areas that you would camp at, that have nice sunny conditions and are protected from the wind and things. But this site, no. It only ever gets dim light that has been very aptly described by the previous archaeologists that worked there as twilight, continual twilight. So it's not a place that you would want to have as a living site. So when you enter it as an archaeologist, you notice right away that it's a very small area. We would not, although it's called a cave, Rhino Cave, it's actually more like just a crack, a fissure in the rock form itself. So it's like a little A shape. On one panel, when you drop down into the site, you see that there are paintings that are probably from recent times. As I said, paint just simply doesn't last very long. So there are paintings on the one wall, and on the opposite wall is this very, very large freestanding outcrop, or virtually freestanding outcrop, that has over 300 carvings on it. And that just dominates your point of interest from the minute that you jump down into the cave. That you have there, it is absolutely unique at Tsodilo Hills. There's 30 other sites that have carvings, but nothing that looks quite like this.
So is that rock formation then obviously natural? Because I couldn't have brought it
It's
in.
natural. Yeah, it's a natural rock formation. It's 7 meters long. It's 2 meters high. When you're standing at the base of it today and you put your arm up, stretched up over your head and up into the top, you can barely tuck your arm into the top of it. And it's over 1 meter in breadth. It has a natural shape, even before the carvings have been added.
Sheila, you're frozen.
Natural slit for a mouth. Now we have no knowledge of how long that slit has been open like that, and it has a natural depression for an eye. Other people that have come in have said it looks like a tortoise's head. It has also been equated to look like a penis. We have no idea. We know what we think it looks like. We have no idea what ancient peoples that had lived, say, 70, 100,000 years ago would have seen. But it is a very striking form, and it is unique even without the carvings.
Okay. You've said that there were some stone points found there, actually buried in the cave?
Yeah. Now the stone points, this is my area of specialty. I have my doctorate in stone tool analysis. And one of the things that made our archaeological team go back to the cave and want to look a little more closely was the original excavators had excavated inside the cave, and they had been very much focused on the paintings. So they had dug a trench of 4 pits directly out from the painted wall to see whether or not they could find anything more about the site. Now, what they, using a very different technique than we use today, they had decided that their interpretation on it was that it was a habitation site, that people had been making stone tools in there. But one of the things they found very unusual is they reported that they said a number of the tools seem to have been made and then just left there. And there's an incredible amount of non-locally acquired stone material here as well. And you think, Tsodilo Hills is a natural source for beautiful, very, very glassy quartz. It has very good quartzite. Why are they bringing in other materials? This is like the coals to Newcastle idea. You've got to carry these from a minimum of 50 kilometers away. Why would you be doing that? So there were a number of questions that we had that we would like to have answered when we went into the cave to look at it again. Now, my colleague was very interested in the carved rock panel rather than the paintings. And so our pit was placed directly underneath the carved rock panel. And what we found there absolutely was beyond our wildest dreams of expectations. We thought we were going to find remnants of the carving of the panel or some other such thing. Well, after 80 centimeters, we dug lots of this very, very light deposit, and it took us a long time because the deposit was so soft. It was basically wind-blown dust that had just formed, so it was like trying to dig in cake flour. It just flew all over the place. So we had to keep shoring up the sides and coming back the next year with more wooden shoring. We finally got deep enough to be able to come to the level where we suddenly reached a level 80 centimeters down that was just solid humanly struck stone pieces. Now, that is normal for an archaeological site. You'll come to a layer that you think, okay, this is now the habitation layer. This is the layer where we see the most amount of activity. But what we found, to just give you an idea of how exceptional this site was, we dug the equivalent of a cubic meter of deposit in the period that has to be older than 40,000 years and could be as old as 100,000 years. We dug 1 cubic meter of that. If you take another similarly dated site and say how many arrowheads or projectile points would you get in that average cubic meter of Middle Stone Age deposit, the average would be 5, maybe 7, being very generous, 10. We had 88 perfect points from that 1 cubic meter. And you go, wait a minute, no, that is virtually impossible unless this is something like a projectile point graveyard. Why have we got all of these points? And the other very, very striking feature was they all were made on individual, what you could call one-off pieces of material. So normally what you would find when you're looking at a collection of Stone Age points is you go, oh, you can pretty much see the type of source and material they went to regularly. All the points look very, very similar to each other. These ones were in beautiful exotic colors. They were extremely nicely made. The debris or the remaining waste material from the manufacture was there with them. But there was no other flakes or other pieces that you would say, oh, this all belonged to the same block of material. They made 5 or 6 points out of this block of material. Every single one was an individual, unique piece. And so that was one of the things that the extreme numbers, the fact that they were in perfect condition, and the fact that they had obviously planned to bring a piece of material to this site, finished manufacturing the point at the site, and then the crowner was they did one of 3 things with those points. They either made them and manufactured them perfectly and then left them there right at the base by this carved panel, or they burned them in a low-level heat so that the piece was actually so fragile that if you just hit it with a finger, it would just fracture. It was all full of little tiny weeny cracks, but you could still see it was a point, but it had been burnt, and so it could not possibly be used. Or they took the piece, they manufactured it perfectly, and then they smashed it right in the middle. Now, this is not any kind of a procedure that you would expect to be in line with the normal reason that a projectile point or an arrowhead is made. It's made for hunting or for butchering or something like that. You're not making it to make it out of a beautiful piece of material that you carried from a great distance and then left inside the cave and then either abandoned it, burnt it, or smashed it. That was one of the main reasons why we started looking to ritual behavior to explain this action.
Yes, indeed. This is what I thought it must be, because surely discovery of points like that could indicate some kind of sacrifice, because they could use it to cut. Sacrifice is normally associated with ritual.
Well, the problem, I would have normally completely agreed with you, except one of the outstanding features about this entire collection is if you use an artifact and you use it to, say, cut something or stab into something or use it anyway, stone isn't as rugged as many people think it is. And it invariably gets something that we call our damage to the edge of the piece, because in the process of using it, you end up damaging it. And especially the very, very sharp, pointy tips. These tips are often extremely thin. And today you can put your finger on the top and you can almost prick it like with a needle. And you think, okay, that's fragile. That would not be able to be used without showing some indication of wear. These pieces were manufactured on the spot and are left on the spot. There is no indication of use at all. So these were just abandoned there.
Wow, that's interesting. Do you not think that, like, even just maybe cutting a throat, which is quite soft material, would that show up on hard stone?
something that would be a one-time use that would be on very, very soft material like that, no, it would not. But then you would not necessarily anticipate that you made the artifact, you had all of the manufacturing waste, and then it was left right there. You would anticipate that you would manufacture it as you normally do on a site. You go somewhere and you use it. And this question has been asked before, how do you know that they didn't take the points outside the site or somewhere else on the site and then use it? And then they were so incredibly neat and tidy, they brought it right back to where they manufactured it. Over a depth of a meter, which would be accounting for potentially tens of thousands of years of this practice, you think, that is an incredible coincidence. Too much of a coincidence to be real. They have to have been manufactured there and left there, unused.
So a rough estimate, what did you say the date of the layer was that they were at?
The difficulty is there's nothing, it's well outside the realms, the limits of C14 dating. So that's out of the question. You have to then go to other types of dating, which this cave being completely surrounded, so small and completely surrounded by stone, makes it a very, very difficult site to date. So as yet, we've had no proper scientific dating done on it. Now, archaeologically, that's unfortunately a relatively common problem. What we do then is we take the diagnostic, very, very obvious tools, which in this case are these points, and we look to other sites in the area that have the same kind of point that can be dated. And we use what we call a relative date, because it's by association. We say, you've got this type of point, we have this type of point, we're going to borrow your date for the time being. And we make it very clear in all scientific reports that that's what we're doing. The relative dates that are for sites that are either within Tsodilo Hills or in the nearby Aha Hills means that these points are most likely to date somewhere between about 70,000 to 100,000 years in age. A number of people have said we're being far too conservative. They could be much older. We're happy to stay with that right now, saying we're borrowing these dates. The tools are absolutely identically manufactured. We'll stay with those dates at the moment. But I would say a rough estimate would be about 70,000 years.
Wow, that's amazing. So this is potential ritualized behavior 70,000 years ago, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what makes it so exceptional.
I mean, in the bigger context of things, what does that mean? Because, you know, for most people, they would think ritualized behavior is associated with things like religion, for example.
Yes, yeah, that's just it. When you get such a pattern of behavior, you then have to look very, very carefully. Now, once again, archaeologists are very good at borrowing from other fields. When you're looking at something that is that old and you're saying, okay, we need something to be able to explain this pattern that we're seeing, because just so many artifacts manufactured in such an unusual place, in such quantity, with unusual raw materials that had to be brought into the site, in a cave that's hidden, it's time to look to anthropology for what are the basics of being able to say something is a ritual. Because normally in the period of study that I work in, we don't have to worry about that because it's far, far too ancient to be looking for ritual patterns. But now we have the situation where we go, okay, we better go back to anthropology and see what anthropologists use as their criteria and whether or not we can apply that to archaeology. Now, one of the interesting things is in anthropology, nobody has ever determined why humans in all parts of the world have rituals, because they're not cost effective. They're nothing that you don't say, oh, if I do that, I will get this obvious return, except in something that is quite often non-tangible. And it's not just a utilitarian thing that you get immediate payback, but there are characteristics, fortunately, of ritual that we could then use and set up ourselves as a criterion list and see whether or not the materials that we had been finding would in any way fulfill all of those characteristics. Now, fortunately, when you perform a ritual, no matter which ritual, anywhere in the world, there are certain criterion that have to be fulfilled, and that is that it normally has to be something that people are going to relate to, that they will be able to identify with, but it has to be very, very full of impact and what they call, a brilliant word, attention grabbing. You have to look down and see something you recognize, but what's happening with it is not the norm, and it really holds your attention. To be able to say that it's ritual, it can't have just occurred once, because a one-time occurrence is not obviously a ritual. So it has to be repeated, and it has to be repeated over a long period of time, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to spot it. It has to have a certain script. You have to do the same thing again and again. If the ritual changes dramatically, again, it would be impossible to spot archaeologically. You have to have a limited range of possibilities. It can't be so complex that the people that are observing this ritual or performing this ritual can't obviously see what it is they're supposed to be doing. And the most important is it has to cost you. It has to be effortful. It can't be an everyday occurrence that is basically meaningless to you. It has to be something that you have to prepare for and you have to give up. Now, if we look back at those points, obviously the fact that they go down through a meter of deposit and have been treated in the same manner over a very long period of time, you see that adhering to that script, people that are coming there have to know that if they're going to come to that cave, they have to prepare themselves with something costly. It's a piece of material that is not local material. You've got to have planned ahead of time, brought that piece to the cave, made that artifact, and then the next point, do you adhere to the script? Yes, you manufacture it and then you either leave it, or you burn it, or you smash it. There's only three things that you can do with that. But we see no indication of just plain manufacture for utilitarian use. So these are arrowheads which are normally associated with hunting, but they're not being used in hunting. And they're much fancier than your normal ones because you had to bring this one piece of what's usually very colorful raw material in from a great distance.
Did you find any bones in this cave at all?
Bones do not survive in that environment, unfortunately. Yes, it would be brilliant if we could find faunal material, but no, this is a very, very harsh environment. And bones, if you've been on a safari in Africa, you know that even in the week or so that you've been there, you've seen, say, a lion kill, and you come back a few days later and you go, I'm sure this is the spot, but there's nothing left. First off, predators eat everything, and then anything that's left on the ground disintegrates very, very quickly. So, no bones.
Okay. So the arrowheads, the points that were left there, would you say they were like a votive offering?
That is the closest that I would, I would definitely say that they were sacrificed in the case of the smashing and the burning. Votive offering and the ones that were manufactured and just abandoned. And fortunately, the same pattern of behavior is seen on the materials that the earlier archaeologists had also excavated. So the points that they had brought up that had intrigued us in the first place, where they said there was manufacturing occurring in this cave, and you go, in this one, this is not an obvious habitation spot, and that they are incredibly complete and very beautiful. And you think, that also doesn't fit with normal manufacturing. What normally you're looking for is a good sturdy piece of material that you're going to be able to use for hunting that's going to hold together while you perform your hunt. These were not fulfilling those categories. So yes, votive or sacrifices.
Ornamental more than purposeful in a way.
Yes. Yeah. You were doing something which again definitely fulfilled the criterion of costly behavior, which is you are performing an action that is giving up a hard-won resource for nothing that is going to give you immediate utilitarian satisfaction. So you have not made an arrowhead to be able to go out and hunt and be a successful hunter. You have made an arrowhead out of a material that you had to acquire from a great distance and bring it to the cave and just leave it there.
Okay. That also again, it does sound like a sacrificial offering. Again, the next obvious step is what are they offering it to? If it's straight in front of this carving, again, it brings back what is the interpretation of the carving? And my opinion, and again, I still think it reminds me of a serpent. Most of the very few examples of turtles or tortoises that I have found have all shown the effigies of the tortoise or turtle depicted in stone or whatever, in dolmens or in mythology, but always with the shell, because the shell is the most important aspect with the tortoise or turtle, whereas this is just the long sort of projectile part, which would be more accurate with a serpent than I would imagine a tortoise, but that's my interpretation, which brings us to the next point of they're delivering ritual offerings to something that looks like a serpent head. Is this serpent worship? I mean...
Well, for modern eyes, I would tend to agree. I would go, well, it certainly all fits. But the thing, too, is keep in mind that just being surrounded by stone in that environment, you're already in a place that, even today, if you bring people to the site, they often are very, very aware of the fact that when they've grown up in an entirely open environment, in a sunny, open area, have never had to go up a very steep hill and have never gone into the rock, that basically, to use a very normal slang word, creeps them out terribly because you go, I'm inside the hill. This is not a normal place for me. And so being inside a rock enclosure in that open environment, which we know prehistoric peoples lived in hundreds of thousands of years ago, to be inside there alone was a very special feeling. As I said, it's very effortful to even just get up that hillside, to know where that hidden cave is, and then to go in to an area that at the time that I'm talking about, when these the first arrowheads were actually being made, that virtually freestanding rock outcrop would have been head height or higher. So when the carvings on it started is a very good question. We have evidence of a broken section of it within the same areas we found the points. So we believe that it was being carved at that time. To modern eyes, it looks like a snake. Could they have been making it look more like a snake by putting indentations into it to make it look more like snake scales? One thing that is often asked is whether or not the projectiles, the arrowheads, could have actually been placed in these carvings. No, they're long grooves. If you put anything in there, it simply falls right back down to the ground. So there's no indication that it was like a little shelf or anything like that. But one thing that does back up the idea that it could be something more like a serpent is one of the experiments we did was using firelight in dark, obviously at night, because you realize that in most, back to the anthropologists have told us that most rituals are performed in darkness. It enhances the effect of the ritual activity. Now, one of the aspects that had been noted before was that this carved panel gets a few hours of direct sunlight in a very, very short period over the winter months. And the sun from this one little crack way up in the top of the cave lands right on the carved panel. And you thought, yeah, that is really exceptional. Until you remember the fact that most rituals occur in the dark. So we did an experiment using, because of course it's a World Heritage Site, we couldn't build a fire. We used smokeless candles, which were quite a treat to carry all the way up that hillside as they're coated in glass. A number of them didn't make it and had to be brought down clinking and clanking. But we took smokeless candles and we made what would be like a little fire down at the base by putting them together as a cluster. And one of the things as we were filming it that we suddenly realized and had not noticed before when we were working right in front of this carved panel for many, many weeks was that the carvings are very, very tight in an area, and then they're very broad, and then they're very, very tightly packed, and then they're very broad again. Under flickering light, this tight, loose makes it look like the entire outcrop is moving. Because of the flickering light, you go tight and loose, just like a snake slithering.
Right.
And that is, and as it's coming straight out of the rock outcrop and the head is rearing up, that is an exceptional thing to get to see.
Wow. That actually just reminds me a little bit of some of those pyramids in Mexico, like the winged feathered serpent pyramid, where they've got these stairs and the sun actually shines on it at a certain, I think it's probably solstice, one of those, and it moves. It appears to like move.
Yeah.
So it's a similar sort of effect.
Yeah, it is. And you can imagine this pre-animation. This is an inanimate object moving, and that would also be very powerful indeed. That you can imagine there would be no animation in your life other than something that should be able to manage it all on its own, and there it is like a stone outcrop moving. That would be very spectacular, especially when it was up above your head. That would be quite an effect.
Yes, because that was a bit, I imagine the layers, as you said,
Yeah,
are a bit lower.
once you dig down, you realize that the floor level you're coming in at today is not the floor level of the time when those arrowheads were made.
Up there, all right. That's very interesting. So would you say then that this is the oldest ritual site ever found? Have we found anything older?
Well, there have been a number reported. The difficulty is that archaeologists are loath to immediately jump to any kind of a ritual explanation. And I must say, it took me a very long time after. It took about almost 7 years after excavating this to come to grips with it in my own mind that there was no other explanation that was feasible, that fulfilled enclosing all these different characteristics that we had and different features on these sites other than ritual. Normally, ritual is something that archaeologists say, okay, I found this, we have no other explanation for it, so it could be ritual. That is an answer that is often referred to, but you think you've got to be able to fill all those characteristics that I mentioned that anthropologists use for being able to determine a ritual. And that isn't that you've just got one occurrence of it, you have to have it as a repeated pattern. Otherwise, as I said, it's not a one-off, it has to be a recurrent pattern. So the fact then that you have this indication of ritual at this early an age means that now other archaeologists will have the opportunity to start looking at some of the materials that they have as well and go, oh, we hadn't really seen it that way. There's a possibility there will be more. At the moment, Rhino Cave is unique in that respect, but I have had contact and communication with other scholars now that are saying, I'm starting to re-look at that one site that was so unusual. So the earliest or the oldest is virtually impossible to say. You can't date it. So we do know that for such an early period when we're still arguing archaeologically among ourselves as to whether these peoples that would have made this were absolutely identical to us, modern humans, as we call them. And you go, yes, I think we can definitely say from a number of the features we're now seeing that have been brought forth from archaeological findings from, say, the last 2 decades. These are definitely modern humans. And earliest forms of ritual, well, we're starting to push that further and further back. Earliest, I wouldn't want to say it was the earliest, but it's definitely a very early candidate.
Yeah, I'd say. It's probably a pre-Diluvian. I'm not sure if the floods ever really hit Africa. I'm not sure on that kind of history at all, but we're looking at a pre-Diluvian time where you've got a serpent ritual site in the middle of, from South Africa, we'd look there and go, that's in the middle of nowhere, literally. That's what Botswana is. It's in the middle of nowhere. But you've got this site in the middle of, the Kalahari Desert that has a serpent effigy in it with potentially items of a votive deposit. It is so exciting for myself to come across all these various bits and pieces, because this very much gives me the indication that this is somehow linked to a much greater culture that's not just isolated to Africa, because serpent worship turns up in so many ancient cultures. It seems to be the oldest form of religion.
Now, the thing is that most indications of religion are much, much more recent. You would have those definitely in the last, say, 1,000 years. 2,000 years would be really pushing it. This is 70,000 years. At that time, the population of our ancient ancestors was still very small. These were small groups of hunters and gatherers, and they would have had very, very large territories. One of the reasons that we're starting to get to grips with how large these territories were was a recent amount of data has come in from analysis that we've been doing on some of those pieces of stone that we knew had to come from further afield. Some of the material is called silkrete, and there's a group of us that have been working on geochemically provenancing the sources of that silkrete. So we take a small chip of the material from Rhino Cave, and we do the same analysis on it as we have done from the areas where we've collected the raw material. And we now know that we have indications that some of that material used to make those points at Rhino Cave came from 300 kilometers away, way down at the bottom end of the Okavango, down by Lake Ngami and the Pateti River. That is a lot of planning. We had originally said 50 kilometers or more. But this is now the first scientific evidence that we have that these peoples, which were, as I said, very, very small groups, were traveling great distances. What's incredible is that for obviously a very long period of time, there was a common understanding of going to Tsodilo Hills and going to that particular site and sacrificing or bringing with you material to leave a certain type of offering there, if you want to go as far as calling it an offering. You certainly knew you had to bring the material and make a point, not any other kind of tool, a point, and leave it there. Whether this is part of a larger pattern is very hard to say because the population was so small at that time. But it's obviously got much better communication than we thought, and it has a stronger cultural relevance there on the concept that ritual would be a possibility. Something that we had found before is virtually impossible to demonstrate for that early a period.
It's amazing. It's thoroughly amazing because obviously for the ritual to take place, there has to be some kind of combined cultural belief that they're all following. And where is that influence coming from?
Mm-hmm.
The other question on that as well is the Kalahari sand that are there that come in and out and migrate that area, were they the original inhabitants of the area, or have they migrated in? Could there have been another sort of race or advanced society that has now kind of fallen away? You know, because we've got those stone circles and stuff that have been found in Johannesburg. I'm sure you must have seen some of that stuff, which indicates that there were mining communities in Southern Africa up to 250,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the San that live there today are the first to say that their group only moved into that area relatively recently. Now, because we do not find any bone materials at all, we have no way of knowing who the peoples were, of course. And bone materials from that very, very early period are very, very few and far between. There's very little human skeletal remains. Without those, it's pure guesswork. But we do know that they were hunters and gatherers at that time. And this is up to 40,000 years ago, which is the junction between the Middle Stone Ages, the period that I work in, and the later Stone Age. So 40,000 years ago, they were still hunters and gatherers. They were still small bands of people. They had large territories. But what we're now seeing is they had greater degrees of communication than we originally thought. And clearly, it makes sense that to acquire material from, say, 300 kilometers away, what we may be seeing is cooperation and networking, where you don't go all that way to collect your piece of material. You get your partners in between, your allies, your cooperation in between to transport that material partly, at least, of the way up to you. That is an area we're now looking at, is how much does this demonstrate then cooperation, networking, even maybe trade?
Trade, I was going to say, this could be commercial almost, trade.
Not quite to that level with such a small budget. You wouldn't be making an awful lot. You wouldn't make your fortune there.
No, of course not. Okay, that's very interesting. Wow. Thank you so much for shedding so much light on this. Do you have anything else you want to add to this?
This has been a very, very special opportunity, and I'm extremely grateful for your continued interest in our research. We last worked in the cave approximately, just slightly over a decade ago. However, the analysis of the material that we've got from there is still ongoing. There's all kinds of new techniques that are coming up that are casting more light every day, such as one I mentioned with the geochemical provenancing of the sourcing of the material, that then adds scientific backing to it. We're also looking at what happens when this material is burnt. There's new scientific evidence as well that allows us to say an awful lot more with regard to that area. We're by no means the only archaeologists working in sub-Saharan Africa. There are great numbers of teams adding every day to the knowledge that we have this period, giving us more and more detail on a fascinating part of our common prehistory.
Thank you. Wow, that's very interesting. Thank you, Sheila. I've really appreciated this opportunity to speak to you.
My pleasure.
I've waited for quite some time. I've just been dying to get more insight into this particular area. And, I'm actually South African, and I haven't been to the site myself. It's quite shameful.
No, it's hard to get to.
I'm so keen to go, though. Really, I am. Next time I get out there, I'll make a plan. If we want to change the world, we must first change the media. Mainstream media exists for the purposes of indoctrination and manipulation of public perception. The world of free and independent media is growing, and with the upsurge in information now available in the public domain, it has never been easier to access free and independent media. The exploration of this information resulted in an experimental project which would provide a fully supported space for researchers, whistleblowers, and seekers of all kinds to express themselves and educate the world. On the 1st of January 2015, Conscious Consumer Network was launched to the world. Nobody thought we would make it this far, but CCN is the longest running free and independent media network of its kind. CCN is a unique collaboration of hearts and souls, bringing you information from different perspectives to educate and inform. Since we started CCN, we have had only one desire: the pursuit of a free, fair, just, sustainable world, and this has not changed. Having overcome many challenges over the last 2 years, CCN is here to stay, and we've got great things lined up for 2017. Help keep CCN on the air by supporting the 2017 Network Support Fund.